I'm Edward, glad to have your company this evening. A special greeting tonight to our listeners in New York. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what do you most enjoy knitting? Leave a comment below, and remember to subscribe so you can return for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Circle That Met Every Tuesday. There are certain rhythms to village life that remain undisturbed through all seasons, and in St. Mary Mead, the Tuesday knitting circle was among the most dependable. It met at 2:30, when luncheon had been cleared and the afternoon stretched ahead with that particular quality of English winter light that made indoor occupations seem not merely acceptable but positively inviting. The circle rotated among sitting rooms, and each hostess understood without being told that the tea should be strong, the fire well tended, and the biscuits plain rather than elaborate. Miss Marple had been a member for more years than she cared to calculate, and she valued the gatherings not merely for the companionship they offered, but for what they revealed. There was something about the steady movement of needles, and the gentle repetition of stitches that loosened conversation in ways that more formal occasions never achieved. People spoke more freely when their hands were occupied, and their eyes on their work. They remembered things. They let slip small details that might otherwise have been carefully guarded. On this particular Tuesday in early February, the circle met at the home of Mrs. Agnes Porter, whose sitting room commanded a pleasant view of the church, and whose tea was always served at precisely the right temperature. Mrs. Porter was a woman of perhaps 55, handsome rather than pretty, with iron-grey hair arranged in a style that suggested both taste and discipline. She had been a pillar of village life for as long as most could remember, serving on committees, organising charitable efforts, and managing the Women's Institute with the sort of quiet efficiency that made everything appear effortless. Miss Marple had always thought her an admirable woman, the sort who could be relied upon in any emergency, though perhaps there was something just a shade too careful in the way she managed village affairs. The other members arrived promptly. Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell came first, a cheerful widow in her 60s whose conversation ran naturally to grandchildren and recipes. She had a comfortable figure, a ready laugh, and a tendency to lose her place in complicated patterns. Miss Marple was fond of her, recognising in Mrs. Hartwell the sort of woman who made village life pleasant through sheer goodwill rather than any particular cleverness. Miss Sarah Pemberton followed shortly after, younger than the others at perhaps 40, unmarried, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that sometimes made her impatient with slower minds. She taught piano to the village children and played the organ at Sunday services with considerable skill. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, were always in motion even when not occupied with needles or keys, as though stillness made her uneasy. Mrs. Eleanor Finch arrived last, apologising softly for her lateness, though she was in fact perfectly punctual. She was a slight woman of middle years, somewhere past 50 but not yet quite elderly, with faded fair hair and a manner so gentle it sometimes seemed she might disappear entirely if one looked away for too long. Miss Marple had known Mrs. Finch for many years, and had always found her a pleasant, obliging sort of person, the kind who volunteered readily for the least attractive tasks and never complained about the arrangements others made. She lived alone in a small cottage near the post office, kept house for the vicar on Thursdays, and maintained a garden that was admired more for its neatness than its beauty. Needles began their familiar rhythm. Mrs. Porter was working on a cardigan in soft blue wool. Mrs. Hartwell struggled cheerfully with a complicated Fair Isle pattern that seemed to defeat her at regular intervals. Miss Pemberton's needles moved with sharp efficiency through a plain scarf in charcoal grey. Mrs. Finch's work was, as always, something for someone else, a small garment for a child in the village whose mother was unwell. The conversation began in its customary way, touching on weather, the morning's post, the vicar's sermon the previous Sunday. Miss Marple contributed her share while her own needles moved steadily through a bed jacket in pale pink. She had learned long ago that the art of listening required one to speak just enough to avoid drawing attention to one's silence. It was perhaps 20 minutes into the gathering when Mrs. Finch set down her needles with an uncharacteristic abruptness. The small click of the needles touching the arm of her chair was loud, enough to interrupt Mrs. Hartwell mid-sentence. "I beg your pardon," Mrs. Finch said quietly. "I seem to be rather distracted this afternoon." Mrs. Porter looked up with immediate concern. "My dear Eleanor, are you quite well? You do look rather pale." "I am perfectly well," Mrs. Finch said, though her hands, Miss Marple observed, had begun to tremble slightly. "It is only that I received something rather unexpected in this morning's post. A letter." "A letter?" Mrs. Hartwell's face brightened with friendly curiosity. "Nothing troubling, I hope?" Mrs. Finch hesitated. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully steady, as though she had rehearsed the words. "It is a letter that was written to me many years ago. Decades, in fact. It has only now been delivered." The quality of attention in the room altered at once. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythm, but her eyes lifted to observe the faces around her. Mrs. Porter's expression remained composed, but her hands had stilled on her work. Miss Pemberton leaned forward slightly, her sharp features intent. Mrs. Hartwell looked merely confused. "But how extraordinary," Mrs. Hartwell said. "However did such a thing happen?" Mrs. Finch drew a folded paper from her handbag with the careful movements of someone handling something both precious and disturbing. "It was forwarded to me by a firm of solicitors in London. They included a note explaining that it had been found among the papers of a deceased client, a Mr. Thornberry who had practiced law in the village until his retirement some years ago. Apparently it had been entrusted to him for delivery, and then somehow remained undelivered all this time." She passed the accompanying note to Mrs. Porter, who read it quickly and passed it on. Miss Marple examined it when her turn came. The solicitor's letter was brief and formal, expressing regret that the matter had been overlooked, and hoping that the delayed delivery would not cause distress. "And the letter itself?" Miss Pemberton asked, her voice rather sharper than was perhaps necessary. "What does it say?" Mrs. Finch's hands tightened on the envelope she still held. "It is addressed to me under my maiden name, Miss Eleanor Ashford. I have not used that name for a very long time." There was a small, peculiar silence. Miss Marple's fingers continued their steady work, but her mind was entirely alert. A letter delayed for decades addressed to a maiden name discovered among a solicitor's papers. The pattern was beginning to suggest itself. "May I ask," Miss Marple said gently, "when the letter was written?" Mrs. Finch turned the envelope over. The postmark was barely legible, but the date could just be made out. 1937, she said quietly. "January of that year." Another silence, this one longer. Mrs. Hartwell looked as though she wanted to ask something but could not quite formulate the question. Miss Pemberton's expression had grown thoughtful. Mrs. Porter set down her teacup with careful precision. "Eleanor," Mrs. Porter said, and her voice was very kind, "you need not share this with us if it distresses you. Some things are better left private." "That is very considerate of you, Agnes," Mrs. Finch said. Her voice remained steady, but Miss Marple could see the effort it required. "But I find that I am not quite certain what to do. The letter speaks of matters I had thought long settled. Obligations, promises, regrets." She paused, then added almost inaudibly, "It asks me to wait, to have patience, to forgive a delay." "After 25 years, Miss Pemberton said. "Rather more than a delay, I should think." 25 years, Mrs. Finch repeated. "Yes, a quarter of a century. I was 29 when this letter was written. I am 54 now." Miss Marple watched the faces around her. Mrs. Porter's concern appeared entirely genuine, but there was something else beneath it, something guarded. Mrs. Hartwell's expression showed only sympathy and confusion. Miss Pemberton looked as though she were working through a calculation. "Were you expecting such a letter at the time?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Finch met her eyes. "I was," she said simply. "I waited for it. When it never came, I assumed that the writer had changed his mind, that the promises made had been reconsidered. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything at all. The warmth seemed to have gone out of the room despite the well-tended fire. The comfortable ritual of the Tuesday circle had been disturbed by something that should have arrived decades earlier, in another world, when the woman who held it had been young enough to believe that waiting might be rewarded. Mrs. Porter stood rather suddenly. "I think we could all do with fresh tea," she said. "Eleanor, you must not distress yourself. Whatever this letter contains, it concerns a past that is long since settled. You have made a good life here. We all think very highly of you." As Mrs. Porter left the room to arrange for more tea, Miss Marple continued her knitting and thought about letters that arrived too late, about promises deferred, and about the particular quality of the silence that had fallen over the room the moment Mrs. Finch had spoken. It was, she reflected, the silence of people who understood more than they wished to say. The needles clicked on, but the comfortable rhythm of the afternoon had been broken, and Miss Marple suspected it would not easily be restored. Chapter 2. A letter passed hand to hand. The fresh tea arrived, brought in by Mrs. Porter's daily help, a stolid woman who moved with the heavy certainty of someone who had been performing the same tasks in the same house for many years. She arranged the cups with practiced efficiency and withdrew without a word, closing the door softly behind her. Mrs. Porter poured with steady hands, and for several minutes the business of tea occupied everyone's attention. Milk was added, sugar declined or accepted, biscuits passed on a plate with a blue willow pattern. The ordinary rituals of hospitality provided a brief respite from the tension that had settled over the room. Mrs. Finch held her cup but did not drink. The letter remained in her lap, the envelope worn at the edges from its long concealment, the paper yellowed with age. Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Finch's eyes returned to it repeatedly, as though she could not quite believe it was real. "Eleanor," Mrs. Hartwell said. Gently, "If you would rather not speak of it, I am sure we all understand. It must have been such a shock." "Thank you, Dorothy," Mrs. Finch said. "You are very kind, but I find that I am not certain how to proceed. For 25 years I believed one thing to be true. Now I discover that something quite different may have been the case." She looked around at the faces watching her. "I wonder if I might ask your opinion. You're all sensible women. Perhaps you can see more clearly than I can at present." "Of course we shall help if we can," Mrs. Porter said, though Miss Marple detected a note of caution in her voice. "What does the letter say, if you're willing to share it?" Mrs. Finch drew a breath and unfolded the single sheet of paper with care. The writing was in ink, the hand clearly masculine, firm and educated. She did not read aloud, but instead summarized, her voice carefully neutral. "It is from someone I knew before the war, a gentleman to whom I was engaged." She paused, and Miss Marple saw the effort it took to continue. "The engagement was broken rather suddenly. He left the village. I understood at the time that he had changed his mind about our arrangement." Miss Pemberton leaned forward. "And the letter explains otherwise?" "The letter speaks of temporary difficulties, financial concerns, family obligations that required his immediate attention elsewhere. He writes that he hopes I will understand the necessity of a brief delay, that he expects these matters to be resolved within a few months, and that he remains devoted to our understanding." Mrs. Finch's voice had grown quieter. "He asked me to wait for him, to have faith in his intentions." The silence that followed was complex. Mrs. Hartwell's face showed simple sympathy. Miss Pemberton's expression was harder to read, a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Mrs. Porter set down her teacup with great care. "How dreadful," Mrs. Hartwell said. "To think that you never received such a letter when you might have, that is, if you'd known." She trailed off, apparently unable to complete the thought. "If I had known he intended to return," and Mrs. Finch said quietly, "I would have waited. As it was, I assumed he had simply chosen to end our engagement without explanation. It was painful, naturally, but one becomes accustomed to such disappointments in time." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. She was thinking about the date on the letter. January '7. The years that had followed had not been kind ones for postponed plans. War had come, and with it disruptions that made all such arrangements seem impossibly fragile. "May I see the letter?" Miss Pemberton asked, extending her hand. Mrs. Finch hesitated only briefly before passing it to her. Miss Pemberton read quickly, her sharp eyes moving over the lines with the efficiency of someone accustomed to reading music at sight. She passed it next to Mrs. Hartwell, who read more slowly, her lips moving slightly. "It seems quite genuine," Mrs. Hartwell said. "How very sad. Do you suppose something prevented him from returning? The war, perhaps?" "That would seem the most likely explanation," Mrs. Finch said. "Though I confess I made no effort to discover what became of him. It seemed better to simply accept what appeared to be the case and move forward with my life." The letter came to Mrs. Porter next. She read it with her customary thoroughness, her face composed but thoughtful. When she passed it finally to Miss Marple, her fingers lingered on the paper for just a moment longer than necessary. Miss Marple read the letter carefully. The writing was indeed firm and educated, the tone one of sincere affection mixed with regret. The writer explained that family circumstances of an urgent nature required his immediate departure from the village. He could not, he wrote, explain the full details, but assured Miss Eleanor Ashford that his regard for her remained unchanged. He expected to have matters resolved by spring at the latest. He asked her to trust him and to wait for his return. It was signed simply, "Yours faithfully, Michael." Miss Marple folded the letter and returned it to Mrs. Finch. "It is certainly genuine," she said quietly. "One can feel the sincerity in every line." "But it raises rather troubling questions, does it not?" Miss Pemberton said. Her voice was crisp. "If the letter was written in January of 1937 and entrusted to Mr. Thornbury for delivery, why was it never delivered? Solicitors are not generally careless with their clients' affairs." "These things do happen," Mrs. Porter said quickly. "Papers are mislaid, files are forgotten. Mr. Thornbury must have been a very busy man." "Was he?" Miss Pemberton asked. "I seem to recall that his practice was rather small. He handled wills and property matters for a few local families, hardly the sort of volume that would lead to such an oversight." Mrs. Porter's expression remained pleasant, but Miss Marple observed a certain tightness around her mouth. "I am sure I could not say. I knew him only slightly." "And yet," Miss Pemberton continued, "it seems extraordinary that a letter of such importance should simply vanish for 25 years. One might almost think," she paused delicately, "one might almost think it had been deliberately withheld." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Hartwell looked genuinely shocked. Mrs. Finch's face had gone very pale. Mrs. Porter remained perfectly still. "Sarah," Mrs. Porter said, and her voice carried a note of gentle reproach, "that is a serious accusation to make without any foundation. Mr. Thornbury was an honourable man. If there was an error, it was surely unintentional." "I make no accusations," Miss Pemberton said. "I merely observe that the circumstances are unusual." Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her mind was working rapidly. The letter had been entrusted to a solicitor who had never delivered it. For a quarter of a century it had remained hidden among his babushkut. And now, after his death, it had finally reached the woman for whom it was intended, long past any possibility of response or reunion. "Eleanor," Mrs. Hartwell said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "do you know what became of this gentleman? This Michael?" Mrs. Finch shook her head. "I made no inquiries. It seemed too painful at the time, and later it seemed pointless. One learns to accept what cannot be changed." "But you might discover what happened to him now," Mrs. Hartwell said eagerly. "There are ways to trace people, records. Perhaps he's still—" "Dorothy," Mrs. Porter interrupted gently. "I think perhaps it would be wiser to let the matter rest. After so many years, what purpose would it serve to reopen old wounds? Eleanor has made a life here. She is valued and respected. To pursue answers about a past that is long settled could only cause distress. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a fraction of a moment before resuming their rhythm. Mrs. Porter's concern was undoubtedly sincere, but it was also, Miss Marple reflected, remarkably well-timed. The suggestion had been made before any decision could be reached, before Mrs. Finch herself had fully absorbed the implications of what she had discovered. "Agnes is quite right," Mrs. Finch said quietly. "What good can come of dwelling on what might have been? The letter has arrived too late to change anything. I am not the young woman who waited for news that never came. I am someone quite different now." "But surely you are curious," Miss Pemberton said. "Surely you would wish to know why the letter was never delivered? Whether this Michael ever tried to contact you by other means? What became of him?" "Curiosity," Mrs. Porter said firmly, "is not always kind. Sometimes the kindest thing is to accept mystery rather than pursue answers that can only bring pain." She looked around the circle, her gaze resting briefly on each face. "I think we all agree that Eleanor's happiness and peace of mind must be our first consideration. She has been content here. We have all been content together. To disturb that contentment for the sake of questions that cannot be answered satisfactorily would be most unwise." Mrs. Hartwell nodded immediately. "Oh yes, of course, Eleanor's well-being must come first." Miss Pemberton said nothing, but her expression suggested disagreement held in check by good manners. Mrs. Finch folded the letter carefully and returned it to her handbag. "You're all very kind to concern yourselves with my feelings. I shall think carefully about what to do." The knitting resumed, though the rhythm was not quite what it had been. The conversation turned to other matters, to parish affairs and the weather, but Miss Marple noticed that the voices were not quite as natural as before. Something had shifted in the comfortable circle, as though a stone had been dropped into still water, and the ripples had not yet settled. When the gathering broke up an hour later, Miss Marple walked home slowly through the February chill. The light was already fading, and the village had that particular quietness of winter afternoons when everyone had retreated indoors. She thought about Mrs. Porter's suggestion that the letter should be set aside, about the sincerity of her concern and the firmness with which she had advocated for letting the past remain undisturbed. There was wisdom in such advice, certainly, but there was also, Miss Marple reflected, a certain convenience. For if the past were truly examined, if the questions were asked, and answers sought, what else might be discovered beyond the fate of one delayed letter? The knitting circle had met every Tuesday for many years. The patterns they worked were familiar, the routines comfortable. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that beneath the surface of such gatherings, other patterns often lay hidden, patterns that reveal themselves only when one looked with particular care at who said what and when and why. She reached her gate and paused to look back toward Mrs. Porter's house. The lights were on in the sitting room where they had so recently gathered. Miss Marple wondered what conversations might be taking place there now, in the quiet aftermath of the afternoon's revelations. Silence could be comfortable, she thought, but it could also be carefully maintained, and the difference between the two was worth understanding. Chapter 3. What was remembered between stitches. The following Tuesday brought milder weather, though the sky remained the particular grey that suggested winter had no intention of loosening its grip just yet. The knitting circle met at Mrs. Hartwell's house this time, a comfortable establishment with rather more clutter than Mrs. Porter's, but considerably more warmth. Photographs crowded every surface, grandchildren smiled from frames of varying sizes, and a large ginger cat occupied the best chair until diplomatically relocated. Miss Marple arrived to find the others already assembled. Mrs. Finch was seated by the window, her hands already busy with her needles, though Miss Marple noticed that her work appeared to have made little progress since the previous week. The same small garment rested in her lap, scarcely longer than it had been 7 days earlier. "Jane, how lovely," Mrs. Hartwell said, bustling forward. "Do come in. I have made seed cake. I know it is yours. Particular favourite." The afternoon began with determined cheerfulness. Mrs. Hartwell spoke at length about her eldest grandson's progress at school. Miss Pemberton described a particularly trying pupil who insisted on playing everything at twice the proper tempo. Mrs. Porter reported on the Women's Institute's plans for a spring bazaar, detailing the various stalls that would be required with her customary efficiency. Mrs. Finch said very little, her needles moving in the slow, steady rhythm of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. It was perhaps half an hour into the gathering when Mrs. Hartwell, with the sort of determined kindness that meant well, but often proved awkward, said, "Eleanor, my dear, I do hope you have not been too distressed by that unfortunate letter. I have been thinking about it a great deal." Mrs. Finch's needles stilled. "You are kind to concern yourself, Dorothy." "Well, naturally one does," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Such a peculiar thing to happen, and it's brought back memories, of course, of that time before the war when you were engaged. I remember it quite clearly, though I was only recently married myself and not paying as much attention to village affairs as I might have done." Miss Marple's own needles continued their quiet work while her attention sharpened. This was precisely the sort of reminiscence that could prove illuminating. People often remembered the past with remarkable clarity when prompted, though they rarely realized what they were revealing. "It was so long ago," Mrs. Finch said softly. "But one does remember certain things," Mrs. Hartwell persisted. "You were engaged to that young man who worked in the city. I cannot quite recall his name." "Michael," Mrs. Finch said. "Michael Ashcroft." "Ashcroft," Mrs. Hartwell repeated. "Yes, of course, the same surname as your own. A cousin, was he?" "A distant cousin," Mrs. Finch confirmed. "We had known each other since childhood, though not well. He came to visit the village one summer, and we became reacquainted. The engagement followed naturally." Miss Pemberton looked up from her work. "I was too young at the time to pay much attention, but I do recall there was talk, an engagement announced and then, quite suddenly, ended." "These things happen," Mrs. Porter said, her voice carrying a note of gentle dismissal. "Young people make promises they cannot keep. It is sad, but not uncommon." "Indeed," Mrs. Finch said. She had picked up her needles again, but her stitches were uneven. "The engagement ended quietly. There was no particular scandal. Michael left the village rather suddenly, and it became apparent that our understanding was at an end." The words had the peculiar quality of a story told many times, smoothed by repetition until all the rough edges had been worn away. Miss Marple recognized the pattern. It was the sort of narrative that communities created when they needed to explain something uncomfortable, a version of events that satisfied curiosity while revealing as little as possible. "But why did he leave so suddenly?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. "Surely there must have been some explanation." "Family matters," Mrs. Finch said, "or so I understood at the time. His father had died not long before, and there were apparently complications with the estate. Financial difficulties, perhaps. One did not inquire too closely into such things." "Most proper," Mrs. Porter said firmly. "Money matters are private affairs." Miss Marple paused in her knitting to adjust her spectacles. "But the letter spoke of expecting matters to be resolved by spring. That would suggest the difficulties were thought to be temporary." Mrs. Finch's hands tightened on her needles. "Yes, but spring came and went. A year passed, then another. War came. One learned not to expect anything." "You never heard from him again?" Miss Pemberton asked. "No, not a word." The room fell quiet except for the clicking of needles and the occasional settling of coals in the fire. Mrs. Hartwell's cat had returned to investigate the possibility of tea, and Mrs. Hartwell shooed it away with absent affection. Miss Marple had been observing the faces around her. Mrs. Hartwell's expression showed simple sympathy and curiosity. Miss Pemberton appeared thoughtful, as though working through some calculation. Mrs. Porter's face remained composed, but there was something watchful in her manner, as though she were anticipating where the conversation might lead, and preparing to guide it elsewhere if necessary. "It must have been 1936 when the engagement was announced," Miss Marple said quietly, "or early in 37. "December of 1936, Mrs. Finch said. We became engaged at Christmas. Michael gave me a ring, nothing elaborate, but it was his mother's, which made it all the more meaningful. And how long was it before the engagement ended? Mrs. Finch thought carefully. 6 weeks, perhaps 7. It was late January when he left. The letter, as you know, was dated January of 1937. A very short engagement, Miss Pemberton observed. Sometimes one knows quickly whether a thing will suit or not, Mrs. Porter said. There was something almost defensive in her tone. Better to recognise unsuitability early than to persist in error. Miss Marple allowed a small pause before speaking again. It must have been a difficult time in other ways as well. I seem to recall that 1937 brought various troubles to the village. Mrs. Porter's needles clicked with particular emphasis. I cannot think what you mean, Jane. Oh, merely the usual concerns of any community, Miss Marple said gently. Financial worries, illness, the sorts of difficulties that require neighbours to support one another. Your own family faced challenges then, did they not, Agnes? Miss Pemberton said, and her tone suggested genuine interest rather than malice. I remember my mother mentioning something about your father's investments going badly. Mrs. Porter's expression remained pleasant, but Miss Marple observed a certain rigidity in her posture. My father made some unwise decisions, yes. It was a trying period, but we managed. One does what is necessary. Your mother was unwell as well, was she not? Mrs. Hartwell said. I remember visiting her once or twice. Such a gracious lady, even in her illness. She was ill for several years, Mrs. Porter said shortly, but again one managed. These are hardly matters of general interest. Of course not, Miss Marple said soothingly. I merely noted that it was a period when many families were under strain. It creates a particular atmosphere in a village when everyone is struggling with private difficulties. One pulls together, naturally. Exactly so, Mrs. Porter said. She seemed relieved to have the conversation turn in this direction. The village has always been at its best when people support one another through difficult times. We are fortunate to live in a community where such support can be relied upon. Mrs. Finch had been silent during this exchange, her needles moving slowly through their repetitive pattern. Miss Marple glanced at her and saw something in her expression, a kind of distant recognition, as though she were hearing an old melody that had once been familiar but was now only half remembered. You were a great help to your own family during that time, were you not, Eleanor? Mrs. Hartwell said kindly. I recall hearing that you took on all sorts of responsibilities. One did what was needed, Mrs. Finch said quietly. My parents were elderly, my father's health was poor. There were matters that required attention. And Michael's departure must have added to your burdens, Miss Pemberton said. Mrs. Finch's needles stilled entirely. Yes, she said after a moment, though one learned to carry on. There was no alternative. Miss Marple thought about burdens and alternatives, about how young women of a certain class and circumstance found their options narrowing when family difficulties arose, an engagement broken, a potential escape from duty withdrawn, a life that settled into patterns of obligation and service. You never considered marrying later? Mrs. Hartwell asked, then immediately looked stricken. Oh, my dear, forgive me, how thoughtless. I should not have asked. Please do not distress yourself, Dorothy, Mrs. Finch said. It is a natural question. The answer is simply that the opportunity never arose again. Or perhaps I was no longer inclined to seek it. One becomes accustomed to living alone. You have never been truly alone, Mrs. Porter said warmly. You have always had the village, friends, occupation, a useful life. Yes, Mrs. Finch said, a useful life. The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple heard in them something that the others perhaps did not, or chose not to hear. Usefulness was indeed a virtue, and one that was much praised in women of Mrs. Finch's generation, but usefulness to others could sometimes come at the cost of possibilities for oneself. The conversation moved on to safer topics, to recipes and parish notices. But Miss Marple continued to think about what had been said and, more significantly, what had not been said. No one had mentioned why Michael Ashcroft's family difficulties had required such sudden departure. No one had asked why a young man who was apparently devoted enough to give his mother's ring would not have written again when the promised spring arrived and the difficulties remained unresolved. No one had questioned the remarkable coincidence that Michael's departure had occurred during the same period when Mrs. Porter's family had been facing financial strain and her mother's illness. These silences were not accidental. They had the quality of spaces carefully maintained, of questions everyone had agreed not to ask. Miss Marple folded her knitting as the afternoon drew to a close. She had learned long ago that the most important information often lay not in what people said, but in what they avoided saying. In St. Mary Mead, as in every village she had known, there were stories that everyone knew and no one told, truths that were acknowledged only through their careful omission from conversation. The engagement had ended quietly, Mrs. Finch had said. No particular scandal. But Miss Marple thought that quiet endings often concealed the loudest truths, and that the absence of scandal sometimes indicated only that everyone had agreed to look away. The needles would continue their clicking, the patterns would continue to grow, but Miss Marple suspected that beneath the comfortable surface of the Tuesday Circle, other patterns were beginning to reveal themselves, patterns that had been carefully hidden for 25 years. Chapter 4, An Engagement Quietly Undone. Miss Marple had occasion over the next several days to visit the lending library, which occupied 2 rooms above the greengrocer's shop and was presided over by Miss Violet Kemp, a woman of determined enthusiasms who believed firmly in the improving power of literature. Miss Kemp had been librarian for 30 years and possessed the useful quality of remembering not only every book in her collection, but also who had borrowed what and when. Miss Marple, she said warmly, as the little bell above the door announced the visitor. How delightful! I have just received the new Dorothy Sayers. Shall I set it aside for you? How thoughtful, Violet. Yes, please do. Miss Marple returned the novels she had finished and began to browse the shelves with the unhurried manner of someone who had no pressing engagements. After a few moments, she said casually, I have been thinking recently about the village as it was before the war. How much has changed and how much has remained the same. Miss Kemp brightened immediately. Discussion of the village's history was among her favourite topics. Indeed, yes, so many changes, and yet the essential character remains, I think. The essential character, Miss Marple agreed. Though there have been difficult periods, of course. I was reminded recently of 1937, a trying year for several families, if I recall correctly. Oh, 1937? Miss Kemp adjusted her spectacles, which had a tendency to slide down her nose. Yes, that was indeed a difficult time, the Porters particularly. Such a shame about Mr. Porter's investments. He had been so careful all his life, and then to lose so much in those mining shares. Bolivian, were they? Or perhaps Chilean. Something South American, certainly. How unfortunate, Miss Marple said sympathetically. And Mrs. Porter Senior was ill at the same time, I believe? Very ill. A stroke followed by complications. She required constant nursing for nearly 2 years before she passed. Agnes gave up a great deal to care for her, of course. She had been engaged herself at the time to a young man from Winchester, but the engagement was quietly ended when it became clear that her mother would need her at home. Miss Marple selected a volume from the shelf and examined it with apparent interest. How sad! Though I suppose these sacrifices are sometimes necessary. Oh, quite necessary, Miss Kemp said firmly. One's duty to one's parents must come first. Though it was hard on Agnes, naturally. She was 28, 29? A difficult age to have one's prospects disrupted. And the young man did not wait. I believe there was some understanding that he would, but after 6 months or so it became apparent that Mrs. Porter's condition was not improving, and the gentleman's family felt the situation was becoming awkward. These things are never spoken of directly, of course, but one understood that he had obligations elsewhere. He married someone else within the year. Miss Marple returned the book to its shelf and selected another. Village life does require a certain willingness to put communal needs before personal wishes. Exactly so, Miss Kemp said with satisfaction. and Agnes has been a pillar of the community ever since. One might say that her sacrifice was not in vain, given all she has accomplished for the village." "Indeed. And there were other families facing difficulties that year as well?" "Oh yes, the Finches, for instance. Mr. Finch had a bad fall that winter, and was never quite right afterwards. Died within the year, poor man. Mrs. Finch Senior was already in poor health, and Eleanor had to take on the management of everything. Not that they had much to manage, but what there was required attention." "I had not realised the timing was so precise," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It was all rather concentrated," Miss Kemp agreed. "January and February of that year seemed to bring one difficulty after another. And then, of course, there was Eleanor's broken engagement. That must have been February, or was it March? No, February certainly, because I remember Mrs. Hartwell mentioning it at the Church Bazaar committee meeting, and that was always held the first week of February. I had forgotten that Mrs. Finch had been engaged. Oh yes, very briefly, to a cousin, I believe. He left rather suddenly. Family matters, one was told, though there was some speculation at the time." Miss Kemp lowered her voice slightly, as though someone might overhear despite the library being empty except for themselves. Some people wondered whether perhaps the young man had learned something about the Finch family circumstances that made him reconsider. Not that Eleanor would have been penniless, but certainly there would have been responsibilities. An invalid mother to care for, no money for servants. Not every young man wishes to take on such burdens. "But the letter that has recently come to light suggests otherwise," Miss Marple said gently. Miss Kemp's eyes widened behind her spectacles. "Letter? What letter?" Miss Marple explained briefly about the delayed correspondence. Miss Kemp listened with increasing fascination. "How extraordinary," she said when Miss Marple had finished. "So he had intended to return, and the letter was never delivered. Do you suppose—" She paused delicately. "Do you suppose Mr. Thornbury simply forgot about it?" "It seems remarkable that a solicitor would forget such a thing," Miss Marple said. "Yes, it does rather. Though Mr. Thornbury was quite elderly by then, perhaps his faculties were already beginning to fail." Miss Kemp frowned thoughtfully. "Or perhaps someone asked him to hold the letter back." "Why would anyone do such a thing?" "Well," Miss Kemp said slowly, "if one were concerned about Eleanor's welfare, and if one felt that she was needed at home rather than running off to marry, one might have thought it of kindest to ensure that she remained available for her family duties, though that would have been rather presumptuous." "Rather presumptuous indeed," Miss Marple agreed quietly. She left the library shortly afterward with 3 novels and a great deal to think about. The afternoon was drawing in, and she walked home slowly, nodding to neighbours as she passed. The village looked exactly as it always did, comfortable and familiar, but Miss Marple was thinking about what lay beneath such surfaces. 2 young women, both facing family obligations, both engaged, both with engagements ended within weeks of each other during that difficult winter of 1937. Agnes Porter had given up her young man to care for her mother. Eleanor Finch had believed her young man had given her up. But what if Eleanor's engagement had been arranged to end just as Agnes's had? What if someone, seeing the Finch family's need for Eleanor's presence, had decided that it would be better for everyone if Eleanor remained unattached and available? The difficulty with such speculation, Miss Marple reflected, was that it required assuming a considerable degree of interference in another person's life. And yet she had seen such interference before, always justified by the best intentions, always presented as being for the good of the person most affected. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting and thought about the patterns that were emerging. Agnes Porter had sacrificed her own engagement out of duty. She had built a life of usefulness and service, becoming the sort of woman everyone admired and relied upon. But had she also expected others to make similar sacrifices? Had she perhaps believed that Eleanor should do the same? The question was not whether such interference had occurred, but whether it could be proved, and whether anyone would wish to examine it closely after so many years had passed. The following Sunday, Miss Marple attended morning service and observed the members of the knitting circle with particular attention. Mrs. Porter sat in her usual pew, composed and dignified, her prayer book held in gloved hands. She sang the hymns in a clear, pleasant voice and listened to the sermon with every appearance of attention. Mrs. Finch sat several rows behind, her face pale and thoughtful. She did not sing, but stood and sat and knelt at the appropriate moments with the automatic movements of long habit. After the service, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Porter on the church path. They walked together toward the gate in discussing the vicar's sermon on the parable of the talents. "A useful reminder, Mrs. Porter said, that we are called to make the most of what we have been given rather than hiding our gifts away." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "though one might also reflect on how talents are sometimes buried not through choice but through circumstance, or through well-meaning others who believe they know best how those talents should be employed." Mrs. Porter glanced at her sharply. "I am not certain I follow your meaning, Jane." "Oh, merely a general observation," Miss Marple said mildly. "One sees it often in village life. A young person with particular abilities or opportunities, and family or friends who guide them toward what seems the more practical or dutiful path, not always with the young person's full consent." Mrs. Porter's expression had become guarded. "Duty is important, surely. We cannot all follow our inclinations without regard for those who depend upon us." "Certainly not," Miss Marple agreed, "though there is perhaps a difference between choosing duty oneself and having that choice made for one by others." They had reached the gate. Mrs. Porter paused, her hand on the latch. "Jane, if you have something particular to say, I wish you would speak plainly." Miss Marple met her eyes with gentle directness. "I was merely thinking about Eleanor Finch's engagement, and about how sometimes when communities pull together during difficult times, someone must be pulled aside to make room for everyone else's needs." Mrs. Porter's face had gone very still. For a moment Miss Marple thought she might deny understanding, might retreat behind platitudes about the past being settled and best left alone. Instead she said quietly, "One does what seems right at the time, what seems necessary." "I am sure one does," Miss Marple said gently. "The question is whether what seemed necessary then, in the urgency of the moment, still appears necessary when examined from the distance of 25 years. Mrs. Porter opened the gate and stepped through without replying. Miss Marple watched her walk away with her characteristic purposeful stride, and thought that sometimes the most difficult truths were those we had told ourselves so often we had come to believe them completely. The afternoon brought rain, and Miss Marple sat by her window watching it fall while her needles moved through their familiar rhythm. She thought about Agnes Porter and Eleanor Finch, about duty and sacrifice, about decisions made on behalf of others with the best intentions and the worst results. And she thought about a letter that should have been delivered in February of 1937, and about who might have had both the means and the motive to ensure that it never reached its intended recipient. Chapter 5: The Comfort of a Shared Version. The third Tuesday of February arrived with a hint of early spring in the air, though the hedgerows remained bare and the gardens showed little sign of awakening. The knitting circle convened at Miss Pemberton's home, a small but immaculately kept cottage that reflected its owner's preference for order and precision. The sitting room was decorated with watercolours of Italian landscapes, souvenirs of a continental tour taken years before, and the piano that dominated one corner gleamed with recent polishing. Miss Pemberton served tea in delicate cups that required careful handling, and offered biscuits arranged on a plate with geometric exactness. She was not, Miss Marple reflected, a woman who enjoyed disorder of any kind, whether in music, household management, or conversation. The gathering began with discussion of a concert to be held at the church hall, featuring Miss Pemberton's more advanced pupils. Mrs. Hartwell expressed, enthusiasm. Mrs. Porter offered practical suggestions about seating arrangements, and Mrs. Finch quietly promised to help with refreshments. The conversation flowed along familiar channels until Mrs. Hartwell, with her characteristic inability to leave difficult subjects unaddressed, said, "Oh, Eleanor, my dear, I have been thinking about your situation, about that letter and what it means." Mrs. Finch's hands paused briefly before resuming their work. "That is kind of you, Dorothy, though I am not certain there is much to think about." "But surely there is," Mrs. Hartwell said earnestly. "It changes everything, does it not? All these years you believed one thing, and now you discover something quite different was true." "What was true 25 years ago," Miss Pemberton said with precision, "what is true now is rather different." "Exactly," Mrs. Porter said, her voice warm with approval. "Sarah is quite right. We must not allow ourselves to be too distracted by past misunderstandings. Eleanor has built a good life here. That is what matters." Mrs. Hartwell frowned slightly as though trying to work through a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit. But if Michael truly intended to return, if he truly cared for Eleanor, why did he never write again? Surely if the letter had simply gone astray, he would have made other attempts to contact her. "Perhaps he did," Miss Pemberton suggested. "Perhaps other letters were also lost." "Rather unlikely," Miss Marple observed mildly. "The postal service, even during those years, was generally reliable." "Then perhaps," Mrs. Porter said, "he discovered upon reflection that the difficulties he faced were more serious than he had initially thought. Perhaps he realized that he could not, in good conscience, ask Eleanor to wait indefinitely while he sorted out matters that might never be properly resolved." "That would explain the silence," Mrs. Hartwell said slowly. "If he felt he could not offer her a secure future, the honourable thing would have been to release her from their understanding." "Though one might have expected him to write and say so," Miss Pemberton observed, "rather than simply vanishing." Mrs. Finch spoke for the first time since the subject had been raised. "People do vanish," she said quietly. "Particularly during those years. The war came, and many things that seemed important before ceased to matter. Perhaps Michael died. Perhaps he married someone else, and perhaps he simply forgot about me." The words fell into the warm room like stones into still water. Mrs. Hartwell looked distressed, Miss Pemberton thoughtful, Mrs. Porter concerned. "Oh, surely not forgotten," Mrs. Hartwell said. "No one could forget you, Eleanor. You are far too—" she floundered, seeking the right word. "Too valuable. Too good." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She was thinking about how conversations revealed truths their participants did not necessarily intend. Mrs. Hartwell had meant to be kind, but the word she had chosen was telling. Valuable suggested utility rather than affection, worth measured in service rather than self. "What I mean," Mrs. Hartwell continued, "is that any young man would have been fortunate to have you as his wife. If Michael could not see that, then perhaps it was for the best that the engagement ended." "These things often are for the best," Mrs. Porter said. "One does not see it at the time, naturally. But looking back, one can recognize that what seemed like disappointment was actually deliverance. You have been spared a great deal of potential unhappiness, Eleanor." "Unhappiness?" Mrs. Finch repeated softly. "Well, consider," Mrs. Porter said, warming to her theme. "A young man who leaves so suddenly, who makes promises he cannot keep, who fails to write or explain. Such behaviour hardly suggests reliability. Had you married him, you might have found yourself tied to someone who disappointed you repeatedly. Instead, you have had independence, security within the village, genuine friendships. Surely that is preferable to a troubled marriage." Miss Pemberton set down her teacup with a small click. "Agnes makes a compelling argument, though one might also observe that Eleanor has had rather more responsibility than independence, caring for aging parents, managing a household on limited means, volunteering for every village need that arose. That is service, certainly, but whether it constitutes security or fulfillment is perhaps debatable." A small silence followed this observation. Mrs. Porter's expression remained pleasant, but Miss Marple detected a tightening around her mouth. "Service to others is its own fulfillment," Mrs. Porter said. "Surely we all agree that a life well lived is one spent in usefulness to our community." "Oh, "Undoubtedly," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly. "Eleanor has been wonderfully useful. We all depend upon her dreadfully." Miss Marple paused in her knitting to adjust a stitch that had gone awry. "It is interesting," she said conversationally, "how we construct explanations for events that trouble us. Each explanation sounds plausible in itself, yet when one considers them together, one notices that they serve a particular purpose." "What purpose, Miss Pemberton asked with interest. "Why, the purpose of maintaining comfort," Miss Marple said. "If Michael was unreliable, then Eleanor is better off without him. If he faced insurmountable difficulties, then silence was his only honourable choice. If he forgot or died or married elsewhere, then there is nothing to be done about it now. Each explanation soothes a different concern, and together they create a version of events that allows everyone to feel satisfied that all has worked out for the best." Mrs. Porter's needles had stilled. "Are you suggesting that our conclusions are somehow false?" "Not false, necessarily," Miss Marple said gently. "Merely convenient. They absolve everyone of any responsibility for what occurred. They require no uncomfortable questions and demand no difficult reckonings. But what questions should be asked, Wominkas?" Mrs. Hartwell said, genuinely confused. "The past is past, surely. Michael left, the engagement ended, Eleanor remained in the village. These are facts." "Facts, yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but facts can be arranged in different patterns, rather like stitches in knitting. One pattern creates a scarf, another creates a glove. The wool is the same, but the purpose served is quite different." Mrs. Finch had been listening to this exchange with an expression that Miss Marple could not quite read. Now she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wonder if I might have been too quick to accept the pattern that was offered to me." "What do you mean, dear?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. "I mean that when Michael left, when no letter came, I accepted the explanation that seemed most obvious. That he had changed his mind, that our engagement had been a mistake. Everyone around me seemed to agree this was the case, and I had no reason to think otherwise. But now I wonder if I should have asked more questions, if I should have tried to contact him directly, rather than simply waiting and then giving up." "You are very young," Mrs. Porter said quickly. "Young people trust those who are older and more experienced. We were trying to help you, Eleanor, to spare you from chasing after something that was clearly not meant to be." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple saw understanding dawn on Miss Pemberton's sharp features. "We?" Miss Pemberton said. "You speak as though there was some general agreement about how Eleanor should be advised." Mrs. Porter's composure wavered for just a moment. "I speak in the general sense, the village collectively. We all had Eleanor's best interests at heart." "I am sure you did," Miss Marple said quietly. "The question is whether Eleanor's best interests were truly identical to what seemed best for everyone else." Mrs. Hartwell looked from face to face with growing alarm. "I do not understand what is being suggested. Are you saying that Eleanor was somehow prevented from pursuing Michael? That people deliberately discouraged her?" "I am saying," Miss Marple said, "that when a community decides something is for the best, individual desires can be overlooked with remarkable ease, and that such decisions are often defended years later by constructing versions of events that make everyone feel justified in what occurred." Mrs. Finch had set down her knitting entirely. Her face was very pale, but her voice when she spoke was steady. "I think I have been accepting other people's explanations for my life for a very long time. Perhaps it is time I sought my own understanding." "Eleanor, please," Mrs. Porter said, and there was genuine distress in her voice. "I beg you not to disturb what has been settled peacefully for so many years. No good can come of reopening old wounds. You have been content here. We have all been content. Why risk that contentment for questions that cannot be satisfactorily answered?" "Because," Mrs. Finch said simply, "I find that I am no longer content with not knowing." The afternoon ended earlier than usual, the members of the circle departing with perfunctory farewells. Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk and thought about shared versions of the past, about how communities created narratives that protected everyone equally, except, perhaps, the person most directly affected. She thought too about Agnes Porter, whose concern for Eleanor seemed genuine, but whose fear of questions seemed equally genuine. There was something being protected here, something that went beyond simple concern for Eleanor's peace of mind. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most comfortable lies were those that everyone agreed to believe, and that such lies could be maintained for decades if no one disturbed them. But lies required constant maintenance, constant reinforcement through the telling and retelling of the agreed-upon version. And now that version was being questioned, its comfortable explanations examined and found wanting. What would emerge when the shared story could no longer hold, Miss Marple wondered? What truths had been hidden beneath 25 years of careful agreement? She reached her cottage as the first stars appeared, her needles tucked safely in her knitting bag, her mind occupied with patterns that were only beginning to reveal their true shape. Chapter 6, What Everyone Had Agreed Not to Ask. Miss Marple had always found that truth emerged most readily, not through confrontation but through patience. She therefore waited, tending her garden and maintaining her usual routines, knowing that disturbance once introduced into a small community had its own momentum. 3 days after the gathering at Miss Pemberton's cottage, Mrs. Finch appeared at Miss Marple's gate just as the afternoon post had been delivered. She stood uncertainly on the path, one hand resting on the latch, as though she had walked this far on impulse, and was now reconsidering. "Eleanor, c'est ta poulière," Miss Marple called from where she knelt by the border, examining the first brave shoots of crocuses. "How lovely! Do come in. I was just about to have tea." Miss Finch entered with visible relief at having the decision made for her. They settled in Miss Marple's sitting room, a comfortable space that invited confidences through its very ordinariness. The tea things were arranged, cups filled, and a small silence established before Mrs. Finch spoke. "I have been to see Mr. Thornbury's successor," she said without preamble, the young man who took over his practice. "I wanted to know if there were any other papers, any explanation for why the letter had been held back all these years." Miss Marple added milk to her tea with steady hands. "That was very sensible. And what did you discover?" "Very little, I'm afraid. The files were incomplete. Mr. Thornbury had not been well organised in his final years, apparently. But there was one thing." Mrs. Finch drew a folded paper from her handbag. A note in Mr. Thornbury's hand clipped to the envelope. It says simply, "Held at AP's request, to be destroyed unopened, if not reclaimed, within 5 years." She passed the note to Miss Marple, who examined it carefully. The handwriting was spidery but legible, dated February 1937. "AP," Miss Marple said quietly. "Agnes Porter," Mrs. Finch said. Her voice was remarkably steady. "I have spent the last 3 days trying to convince myself that the initials might stand for someone else. But there is no one else they could reasonably indicate. Agnes asked Mr. Thornbury to hold the letter back. She asked him not to deliver it to me." Miss Marple poured more tea, giving Mrs. Finch time to gather herself. The revelation was clearly not unexpected. Mrs. Finch had already begun to suspect. But confirmation brought its own particular pain. "Have you spoken with Mrs. Porter?" Miss Marple asked. "Not yet. I find I do not quite know what to say. How does one ask such a question? Did you deliberately prevent me from receiving a letter that might have changed my entire life?" Mrs. Finch's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "And yet I must ask. I cannot continue as we have been, pretending nothing has changed, attending the Tuesday circle as though I did not know." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently, "I do not think you can continue that way. But perhaps the conversation need not be as difficult as you fear. Miss Porter is not, I think, a cruel woman. Whatever she did believing it was right." "But how could she have believed it was right?" Mrs. Finch's voice rose slightly, the first real anger Miss Marple had heard from her. "What gave her the right to make such a decision on my behalf?" The belief, perhaps, that she knew better than you did what was best for you, Miss Marple said. It is a common failing among those who have managed their own lives with discipline and success. They come to believe that their wisdom extends to managing others' lives as well. Mrs. Finch was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had regained its customary quietness. "Will you come with me when I speak to her? I find I am not brave enough to go alone." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "though I think you will find you are braver than you know." They walked together to Mrs. Porter's house as the afternoon light began to fade. Mrs. Porter answered the door herself, and her face when she saw them both standing there suggested she had been expecting this visit. Perhaps had even been relieved that it had finally come. "Eleanor, Jane, please come in." They settled in the same sitting room where the circle had met just 3 weeks earlier. Mrs. Porter did not offer tea. Instead, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited. Mrs. Finch withdrew the note from her handbag and placed it on the table between them. "I think you know what this is." Mrs. Porter looked at it but did not touch it. "Yes," she said simply. "I know." "Why?" Mrs. Finch asked. "Why did you ask Mr. Thornbury to hold back Michael's letter?" Mrs. Porter drew a slow breath. "Because I believed it was necessary. Because your parents needed you and you would have left them if you had known Michael intended to return. Because I thought the situation was temporary, that Michael's difficulties would resolve themselves within a few months as he had promised, and that by then your parents' immediate crisis would have passed." "But it did not pass," Mrs. Finch said. "No, your father died that spring. Your mother lingered for another year, and by then—" Mrs. Porter's voice faltered. "By then it seemed too late to undo what had been done. The war was approaching. Everything was uncertain. I told myself that Michael had surely moved on, that he had likely forgotten his promise as young men do." "You told yourself," Mrs. Finch repeated. "But did you know? Did you make any effort to discover whether he had tried to contact me by other means?" Mrs. Porter's silence was answer enough. Miss Marple spoke for the first time since they had entered. "You were facing your own family difficulties at the time, Agnes. Your mother's stroke, your father's financial troubles. Your own engagement had ended so that you could care for your mother. Is that correct?" Mrs. Porter looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude and resignation. "Yes, I had given up my own prospects out of duty. I believed Eleanor should do the same. It seemed only fair." "Fair?" Mrs. Finch's voice was barely audible. "I know how that sounds," Mrs. Porter said quickly. "But you must understand I was not thinking clearly. I was exhausted, grieving, angry at the choices life had forced upon me. When I saw that you were about to escape the same fate, to go off with Michael while I remained trapped, She stopped, struggling for words. "I convinced myself I was acting for your own good, that your duty to your parents must come first, as mine had, that personal happiness was a luxury neither of us could afford." "But it was not your decision to make," Mrs. Finch said. "No," Mrs. Porter agreed, "it was not, and I have known that for 25 years, though I have tried very hard not to examine it too closely." The three women sat in silence. Outside, a blackbird sang its evening song. The ordinary sounds of the village continued unchanged, while inside this room, truths long buried were finally being acknowledged. "Did anyone else know?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Did you act entirely alone?" Mrs. Porter hesitated. "I discussed it with my mother before I went to Mr. Thornbury. She agreed it was for the best, that Eleanor's family must be the priority, and I believe I may have mentioned the situation to one or two others who were concerned about how the Finch household would manage. Everyone agreed that Eleanor staying was the sensible solution." "Everyone," Miss Marple murmured. "How many conversations took place, I wonder, in which Eleanor's future was discussed and decided without her knowledge?" Mrs. Porter's face had gone pale. "We meant well. We truly believed we were acting in Eleanor's best interests as well as her family's. The village pulls together in times of need. That is what we do." "By pulling certain people aside," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "By making decisions on their behalf and then maintaining those decisions through—" Mrs. Finch stood abruptly. She walked to the window and stood looking out at the darkening garden. When she spoke, her back was still turned. "You stole my choice from me, Agnes. You decided that your view of duty should govern my life, and then you allowed me to believe for 25 years that Michael had simply abandoned me. Do you understand what that has meant? The doubt I carried, the sense that I was somehow unworthy of being chosen." "I am sorry," Mrs. Porter said, and her voice broke on the words. "Eleanor, I am truly, deeply sorry. If I could undo it, I would, but I cannot." Mrs. Finch turned from the window. Tears were running down her face, but her voice remained steady. "No, you cannot. But you can tell me the truth now, all of it. Every conversation you had, every person you consulted, every decision that was made about my life without my knowledge. I want to know exactly what was done, and by whom, and why." Mrs. Porter nodded slowly. Yes, I will tell you everything." Miss Marple rose quietly. "I think perhaps I should leave you both to talk privately. Eleanor, you know where to find me if you need me." She let herself out into the February evening, leaving the two women to the difficult work of honest reckoning. As she walked home, she thought about good intentions and terrible choices, about how easily communities could conspire in small cruelties while believing they were acting with kindness. The letter had been intercepted, held back, nearly destroyed, and Eleanor Finch's life had been shaped by that decision, moulded into a pattern of usefulness and accommodation, while she believed herself rejected and unworthy. Miss Marple reached her cottage and stood for a moment looking up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Truth was emerging now, painful but necessary. What remained to be seen was whether anyone could find their way to something resembling forgiveness or peace. The needles would wait until tomorrow. Tonight there was only the quiet of evening, and the recognition that sometimes the greatest mysteries were not who committed a crime, but why good people chose to do harm. Chapter 7. A Pattern Seen at Last. The Tuesday following Eleanor Finch's confrontation with Agnes Porter brought weather that could not quite decide between winter and spring. Rain threatened, but never quite fell, and the light had that peculiar quality of being both bright and subdued at once. The knitting circle met at its appointed time, though whether all members would attend remained uncertain. Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Hartwell's house to find only the hostess present, arranging tea things with nervous energy. "I do not know if anyone will come," Mrs. Hartwell confessed. "Sarah sent a note saying she would be late. Agnes has not responded at all. And as for Eleanor—" She broke off, shaking her head. "Jane, what is happening? I have heard rumours, whispers in the village, but nothing clear." "The truth is happening," Miss Marple said gently. "It is often untidy." Miss Pemberton arrived next, her sharp eyes taking in the situation immediately. "Small gathering today." "Gathering? It seems. Should we wait or shall we begin?" Before anyone could answer, Mrs. Porter appeared at the door. She looked as though she had not slept well, but her bearing remained upright, her dress immaculate as always. "I hope I am not intruding," she said quietly. "I was not certain whether I would be welcome." "Of course you are welcome, Agnes," Mrs. Hartwell said immediately, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "You're always welcome. Please, come in." They arranged themselves in their customary seats, needles were drawn out, but no one began to work. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Miss Pemberton said with its characteristic directness, "Eleanor is not coming, I take it?" "I do not know," Mrs. Porter said. "We spoke at length after she came to see me. I told her everything she wished to know, but I have not seen her since." "Everything?" Miss Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "That must have been a considerable conversation." Mrs. Porter met her gaze steadily. "Yes, it was." Mrs. Hartwell looked from one face to another with growing distress. "Will someone please explain what has occurred? I feel as though I am the only person present who does not understand what is being discussed." Miss Marple set down her knitting bag. Perhaps it would be best if Agnes explained, but only if she wishes to do so. Mrs. Porter drew a slow breath. Eleanor discovered that the letter from Michael Ashcroft was deliberately withheld from her 25 years ago, at my request. The words fell into the room like pebbles into a pond. Mrs. Hartwell's face registered shock, then confusion, then a dawning comprehension that brought distress in its wake. "You asked the solicitor not to deliver it," she said faintly. "But why?" "Because I believed Eleanor was needed at home," Mrs. Porter said. Her voice was steady, but the effort it required was visible. Her parents were in crisis. I thought it would be temporary, that Michael would return once his affairs were settled, and that by then Eleanor's immediate obligations would have passed. I was wrong. Miss Pemberton's needles began to move with sharp clicks. "You were not merely wrong, Agnes. You were presumptuous. What gave you the right to make such a decision?" "Nothing gave me the right," Mrs. Porter said. "I believed at the time that I was acting for everyone's good, but I see now that I was acting primarily from my own sense of what was fair. I had sacrificed my own engagement. I thought Eleanor should do likewise." "Your own engagement," Mrs. Hartwell repeated. She had picked up her knitting, but her hands were not steady. "I had forgotten about that. You were to marry that young man from Winchester." "Yes, I ended it to care for my mother. It seemed the only proper course." Mrs. Porter's voice had grown quieter. "But watching Eleanor prepare to leave, to marry and be happy while I remained bound by duty, I found I could not bear it. So I convinced myself that her duty must come first as well." Miss Marple had been watching Mrs. Porter's face throughout this recitation. What she saw there was not the defiance of someone convinced of their righteousness, but the exhaustion of someone who had carried a burden of guilt for far too long. "Were you the only one involved?" Miss Pemberton asked. "Or did others know?" "My mother agreed it was necessary, and I discussed Eleanor's situation with several people who were concerned about how her family would manage. The general consensus was that Eleanor remaining in the village was the sensible solution." Mrs. Porter paused. "I did not tell anyone explicitly about intercepting the letter, but I made it clear that I thought Eleanor's engagement should be discouraged, and I believe I was understood." The sound of the front gate opening made everyone turn. Mrs. Finch entered quietly, removing her coat in the hallway before joining them. Her face was pale but composed, and she carried her knitting bag as she always did. "Good afternoon," she said. "I apologize for my lateness." The greetings that followed were awkward, uncertain. Mrs. Finch took her usual chair and drew out her work, the same small garment she had been knitting for weeks. For several moments, only the click of needles broke the silence. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. "Eleanor, my dear, we are very glad you came." Mrs. Finch looked up with a small sad smile. "I considered staying away, but I realized that would be allowing others' choices to govern my behavior yet again. I'm tired of accommodation." "I do not blame you," Miss Pemberton said warmly. Mrs. Hartwell was openly crying, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Oh, Eleanor, how dreadful for you! To discover after all these years that you were deliberately deceived. I do not know how you can bear it." "I am bearing it," Mrs. Finch said quietly, "because I must, and because dwelling in anger serves no purpose. What is done cannot be undone." Miss Marple sat down, and Marple set to her needles and removed her spectacles to polish them, a habitual gesture when she was thinking carefully. "If I might observe," she said, "what strikes me most forcefully about this situation is not the original deception, grievous though it was, but the pattern it established. A pattern that has continued for 25 years. "What pattern?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. "The pattern of Eleanor's life being arranged around the needs and expectations of others," Miss Marple said. "After her parents died, she did not leave the village to seek her own path. She remained useful and obliging, always ready to volunteer, always willing to take on tasks others found inconvenient. She has been valued certainly, but valued primarily for her usefulness." Mrs. Finch's hands had stilled on her work. Yes, she said softly. That is exactly right. I have spent 25 years being grateful for small kindnesses, accepting whatever role was offered to me, never asking for anything because I believed I'd already been found wanting. If Michael did not choose me, I thought, then perhaps I was the sort of person meant to be chosen for errands and committees, but never for myself. But Michael did choose you, Miss Pemberton said fiercely. He wrote asking you to wait. You never received the letter because it was deliberately kept from you. Yes, Mrs. Finch looked at Mrs. Porter, and her expression was complex, containing anger and sadness and something approaching pity. Agnes made a choice that shaped my entire life, and I allowed it to continue shaping my life long after the original choice had been made. I accepted the role that was given to me, because I could not imagine any other. Mrs. Porter's face was wet with tears, though she made no sound. I am sorry, she whispered. Eleanor, I am more sorry than I can express. I know you are, Mrs. Finch said, and I'm trying to find my way toward forgiveness. But forgiveness does not mean pretending what happened was acceptable. It does not mean returning to the comfortable pattern that we have maintained all these years. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The letter that arrived after so long did not create this situation. It merely revealed what had always been true. That is why it has been so disturbing, not because it changed anything, but because it made visible what everyone had agreed not to see. What do you mean? Mrs. Hartwell asked. I mean that on some level, perhaps everyone in this circle knew that Eleanor's life had been constrained in ways that benefited the rest of us, Miss Marple said gently. She was always available, always willing, always grateful. It was very convenient, and as long as we believed she was content, we need not examine our own complicity in maintaining that arrangement. The words settled over the group like snow. Mrs. Hartwell looked stricken. Miss Pemberton's expression suggested she was confronting an uncomfortable truth. Mrs. Porter simply bowed her head. Mrs. Finch began to work again, her needles moving through their familiar rhythm. What I've realized, she said, is that the letter itself is not the point. Whether Michael tried to contact me by other means, whether he survived the war, whether he married someone else, these questions matter less than I thought they would. What matters is that I know now that I was chosen, that someone wanted me for myself, not for what I could do for them, that knowledge changes how I see everything that came after. What will you do? Miss Pemberton asked quietly. I do not yet know, Mrs. Finch said, but I know I will not continue as I have been. I am 54 years old. That is not too old to choose a different pattern for what remains. The afternoon continued, but the comfortable rhythm of past gatherings did not return. Conversations were careful, stilted. When the circle disbanded, the farewells carried a note of uncertainty, as though no one was quite sure whether these gatherings would continue or in what form. Miss Marple walked home through the uncertain weather, thinking about patterns revealed and lives reconsidered. The truth had emerged not through accusation but through simple recognition, through one woman finally seeing clearly what had been done to her and refusing to accept it any longer. What would come next remained to be seen. But Miss Marple suspected that the comfortable circle that had met every Tuesday for so many years would never be quite the same again. And perhaps, she reflected, that was not entirely a bad thing. Chapter 8. The Cost of Keeping Still. 2 days of rain followed the Tuesday gathering, the sort of persistent February drizzle that made the village seem smaller and more enclosed. Miss Marple spent the time indoors, catching up on correspondence and mending, her mind returning frequently to Eleanor Finch and the revelations that had so thoroughly disrupted the comfortable patterns of the knitting circle. On the third morning the rain eased to a fine mist, and Miss Marple ventured out for a walk. She had reached the post office when she encountered Mrs. Finch, emerging with a small parcel under her arm. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said warmly, "how are you managing?" Mrs. Finch smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "Well enough, thank you. I wonder, might you have time for a brief walk? I find I would value your company." They walked together along the lane that led past the church and out toward the open countryside. The hedgerows dripped with moisture, and the fields beyond lay quiet under grey skies. For some minutes they walked in companionable silence, their footsteps the only sound apart from the occasional call of a crow. Finally Mrs. Finch spoke. "I wanted to thank you, Jane, for seeing what others did not, or would not, for asking the questions that needed to be asked." "I merely observed," Miss Marple said gently. "You did the difficult work of pursuing the truth?" "Yes, well," Mrs. Finch paused to adjust the parcel she carried. "The truth has proved rather more complicated than I expected. I thought discovering what happened would bring clarity, but instead I find myself questioning everything I believed I understood about my own life." They had reached a stile that led into a meadow. By unspoken agreement they stopped there, leaning against the weathered wood while the mist drifted past. "I have been thinking," Mrs. Finch said slowly, "about what you said at the circle, about patterns and accommodation, about how I've spent, 25 years being useful to others while believing myself fundamentally unchosen. And I realise now that I have known the truth all along, not consciously perhaps, but in some deeper part of myself." Miss Marple waited, sensing that Mrs. Finch needed to work through this understanding in her own time. "When Michael left and no letter came," Mrs. Finch continued, "I told myself to be sensible, to accept what appeared to be true, but there was always something that did not quite fit. He had given me his mother's ring. He had spoken of our future with such certainty. The sudden departure, the complete silence, it did not match the man I had known. But everyone around me seemed to accept it without question, and so I told myself I must be imagining inconsistencies that were not truly there." "It is very difficult," Miss Marple observed, "to trust one's own perceptions when everyone else appears to see things differently." "Yes, and as time passed it became easier to accept the version of events that others presented, that Michael had been unreliable, that the engagement had been a mistake, that I was better off without him. These explanations were offered with such certainty, such kindness even, that questioning them seemed ungrateful." Mrs. Finch's voice had grown quieter. "I was young, grieving my father's death, overwhelmed by my mother's illness. It was simpler to let others guide me, to accept their understanding of what had happened." A bird sang tentatively from a nearby tree, testing whether spring might be approaching. Miss Marple thought about how communities could be both supportive and suffocating, how the same people who offered help could also impose limitations. "What I have realised over the past few days," Mrs. Finch said, "is that I felt the absence of that letter like a dropped stitch in knitting. You know how it is. You continue working, and the pattern looks almost right. But something is slightly off, the tension is wrong, and if you are honest with yourself, you know where the mistake had occurred, but examining it means unravelling a great deal of work you have already completed." "So you chose to continue despite knowing the pattern was flawed," Miss Marple said. "I did. For 25 years I continued, each stitch building on the one before, creating a life that looked acceptable from a distance, but that I knew in my deepest self was built on something fundamentally wrong." Mrs. Finch turned to face Miss Marple directly. "The letter arriving did not create the problem. It merely forced me to acknowledge what I had always known, but had agreed not to examine." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the others in the circle? Do you think they knew as well?" Mrs. Finch considered this carefully. "I think they knew in the way one knows things that are too uncomfortable to acknowledge openly. Agnes certainly knew she had created the situation, but the others? Dorothy is kind, but not particularly observant. Sarah is sharp, but young enough at the time to have been unaware of the details. Over the years, they have accepted the version of events that everyone agreed upon. It became the truth through repetition." "And yet that agreed-upon truth was a burden to you," Miss Marple said. "Yes, because I was required to live as though it were completely true, even though some part of me always knew it was not. I had to be grateful for small kindnesses, had to prove myself worthy of inclusion, had to never suggest that perhaps I had been treated unfairly. The price of remaining part of the community was accepting their version of my own story. They began walking again, following the lane as it curved back toward the village. The mist was lifting slightly, revealing the familiar shapes of cottages and gardens. Agnes has apologized repeatedly, Mrs. Finch said. She is genuinely remorseful, and I believe her when she says she thought she was acting for my benefit, as well as everyone else's, but what is difficult to forgive is not the original deception, though that was grievous enough, but the years of silence that followed. She saw how I lived. She saw me become smaller and more cautious, saw me accept less and less for myself while giving more and more to others. And she said nothing. Perhaps she could not, Miss Marple suggested gently. Once so many years had passed, acknowledging the truth would have required acknowledging her own role in shaping your life. That is a very difficult thing for most people to do. I suppose that is true, but the result was that I lived within a silence that protected everyone except myself. Every time someone praised my usefulness, every time I was thanked for my help with some village matter, I was being reminded of the role I had been assigned. The good, helpful Eleanor who could always be relied upon because she had nothing else to occupy her time or affection. They had reached the edge of the village proper. Mrs. Finch paused at the corner where the lane met the high street. "What will you do now?" Miss Marple asked. "If you do not mind my asking." Mrs. Finch looked down at the parcel she carried. "This contains wool for a shawl I have been planning. For myself, not for someone else. It seems a small thing, but it feels significant. I am going to begin making choices for my own sake rather than out of obligation or the expectation of approval." "That seems very sensible," Miss Marple said. "I do not know yet what larger changes I might make," Mrs. Finch continued. "Whether I will remain in the village, whether I will continue attending the Tuesday circle, whether I will try to discover what became of Michael. These decisions require more thought. But I know I cannot continue as I have been, living within the pattern others created for me, while pretending I chose it myself." She turned to Miss Marple with an expression that held both sadness and determination. The cost of keeping still, of maintaining the comfortable circumstance was my own sense of self. I became what others needed me to be because I believed I had no right to be anything else. But the letter reminded me that once someone saw me differently. Someone wanted to choose me, to wait for me, to build a life with me. And even if that chance is long past, knowing it existed changes how I see everything that followed. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I think it would." They parted at the corner, Mrs. Finch heading toward her cottage, and Miss Marple toward the shops. As she walked, Miss Marple reflected on the particular courage it required to acknowledge that one's entire adult life had been shaped by deception and accommodation. Eleanor Finch had spent 25 years believing herself rejected and unworthy, building a life around that belief, and now she was being asked to reconstruct her understanding of herself at an age when most people preferred to leave such fundamental questions unexamined. But perhaps Miss Marple thought it was never too late to recognise dropped stitches and choose to unravel the work back to where the mistake had occurred. The resulting garment might be smaller than originally planned, but at least it would be honestly made, with the pattern one had chosen for oneself, rather than one that had been imposed by others' well-meaning interference. The village looked exactly as it always did. Comfortable and familiar, but beneath that surface, Miss Marple knew, one woman was beginning the difficult work of reknitting her life according to her own design. Whether others in the village would accept that change remained to be seen. She purchased what she needed and walked home through streets that were beginning to dry as the sun broke tentatively through the clouds. Spring was still some weeks away, but the promise of it was there in the lengthening days and the first brave shoots in the gardens. Change came slowly to villages, Miss Marple reflected, but it came nonetheless, whether through dramatic revelation or quiet determination. And sometimes the most significant changes were those that happened within a single person who finally recognized the cost of silence and chose to speak. Chapter 9, The Truth Spoken Without Accusation. The fourth Tuesday of February brought the first genuine hint of spring. A warming in the air that made one think of daffodils and longer evenings. The knitting circle was scheduled to meet at Miss Marple's cottage, and she prepared for it with particular care, arranging chairs to encourage conversation, setting out her second-best china, and baking a seed cake that filled the house with the comforting scent of caraway. She was not certain who would attend. The previous week's gathering had ended in discomfort and uncertainty, but at precisely 2:30, the small gate clicked open, and Mrs. Hartwell appeared, followed closely by Miss Pemberton. They were barely settled when Mrs. Porter arrived, her face showing the signs of sleepless nights but her bearing as composed as ever. Mrs. Finch came last, and Miss Marple noted with quiet approval that she carried a new piece of work, a shawl in soft grey wool that was clearly meant for herself rather than for charity. The greetings were cautious, the settling into chairs accompanied by more fussing than usual. Miss Marple poured tea and passed cake, allowing the ordinary rituals to establish a sense of normalcy before anyone ventured into more difficult territory. It was Miss Pemberton who finally broke the careful silence. I have been thinking a great deal about what has been revealed these past weeks, about my own part in maintaining convenient fictions. Mrs. Hartwell looked startled. Your part, Sarah? But you were hardly more than a child when Eleanor's engagement ended. How could you have been involved? I was 19, Miss Pemberton said precisely, not a child, and in the years since I have been part of this circle, have listened to the agreed-upon version of Eleanor's history, and have never once questioned whether it might be incomplete or inaccurate. That is a form of complicity. Mrs. Porter set down her teacup with hands that trembled slightly. Sarah, you cannot blame yourself for trusting what you were told. Can I not? Miss Pemberton's voice was sharp but not unkind. I pride myself on observation, on seeing through surface appearances to underlying truths, yet I accepted without question a narrative that, had I examined it honestly, contained obvious gaps and inconsistencies. Miss Marple had been listening carefully while her needles moved through their familiar rhythm. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but clear. Perhaps it would be helpful if we considered not individual blame but collective understanding. What has emerged over these weeks is not simply that one person made a grievous error of judgment, but that a community maintained that error through years of careful silence. I am not certain I understand, Mrs. Hartwell said. Let me explain what I have observed, Miss Marple said. She set down her knitting and removed her spectacles to polish them, a gesture that drew everyone's attention. When Eleanor's letter first appeared, my interest was captured not by the letter itself, but by the reactions it provoked. Who was concerned, who was curious, who wished to discourage further inquiry. Mrs. Porter's face had gone pale, but she did not look away. Agnes, Miss Marple continued, your immediate response was to suggest that the letter should be set aside for the sake of peace. That concern was genuine. You truly did not wish Eleanor to be hurt. But your suggestion came with remarkable quickness, before Eleanor herself had fully absorbed what the letter meant. That suggested to me that you had particular reasons for wishing the matter to remain unexamined. I did, Mrs. Porter said quietly. I knew what the letter would reveal if pursued. Yes, and as the weeks progressed, certain patterns became visible. Miss Marple picked up her needles again, using them to emphasize her points with small, precise gestures. The broken engagement had occurred during a period of significant difficulty for several families, including your own. You had recently sacrificed your own prospects to care for your mother. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Mrs. Hartwell was following the explanation with increasing distress. Are you saying that Agnes deliberately prevented Eleanor from marrying so that Eleanor would remain available to care for her own parents? I am saying, Miss Marple said carefully, that Agnes made a decision she believed to be in everyone's best interests during a moment of extraordinary personal difficulty. She was exhausted, grieving the loss of her own future and genuinely concerned about how Eleanor's family would manage. In that state, it seemed reasonable to her that Eleanor should make the same sacrifice she herself had made. But it was not reasonable, Miss Pemberton said. It was presumptuous and controlling. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but understanding why someone acted as they did does not require us to approve of their actions. Agnes believed she was acting out of fairness and necessity. She was wrong, but her wrongness came from a place of pain rather than malice. Mrs. Porter had been sitting very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Now she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I have spent 25 years telling myself that I did what was necessary, that Eleanor's family needed her more than Michael did, that she had duties that must take precedence over personal happiness. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I was angry that she might escape the trap I found myself in. I wanted her to suffer as I was suffering. Agnes, no, Mrs. Hartwell said, reaching out to touch her arm. Yes, Mrs. Porter said firmly. I must be honest about this, Dorothy. When I went to Mr. Thornbury and asked him to hold back the letter, I told myself I was acting for Eleanor's good. But in my heart, I knew I was acting to prevent her from having something I could not have. And once the decision was made, once months had passed and then years, I could not bring myself to acknowledge what I had done. So I created a version of events that made Eleanor's remaining in the village seem natural and inevitable. And everyone else accepted that version because it was comfortable. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And therein lies the particular cruelty of what occurred. Not in the original deception alone, but in the way that deception was reinforced through years of careful agreement. Every time Eleanor volunteered for some task, every time she was praised for her usefulness, every time someone expressed gratitude for her reliability, that false version was being strengthened. We made her complicit in her own confinement, Miss Pemberton said, her voice sharp with recognition. In a sense, yes, Miss Marple said. Though I would say rather that Eleanor was required to perform contentment in order to maintain her place in the community. To suggest she might have been wronged would have been to suggest that others had wronged her, which would have disrupted the comfortable fiction everyone had agreed to believe. Mrs. Finch had been working steadily on her shawl throughout this conversation. Now she paused, though her eyes remained on her work. What Jane describes is exactly how it felt. I was not permitted to be unhappy about my situation because everyone had assured me it was for the best. To express disappointment would have been ungrateful. To seek something different would have been selfish, so I learned to be satisfied with small kindnesses and to present a face of contentment even when I felt the absence of choice like a constant ache. Mrs. Hartwell was crying openly now, tears running down her round face. Eleanor, I am so sorry. I never understood. I thought you were genuinely content. I would never knowingly have contributed to your unhappiness. I know that, Dorothy, Mrs. Finch said gently. You are not responsible for what you did not know, but you are responsible for not asking. We all choose what we examine and what we allow to remain comfortable and unquestioned. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, allowing the words to settle. After a moment she continued. What I found most illuminating about this situation was not the original deception, but the mechanism by which it was maintained. Human nature revealed itself in who benefited from keeping quiet, who feared the disruption that truth would bring, and who learned to live within silence because they believed they had no alternative. You are speaking of me, Mrs. Porter said. Her face was wet with tears now, though she made no move to wipe them away. I benefited from Eleanor's presence in the village. I feared the disruption of acknowledging what I had done, and I convinced myself that the passage of time had made the truth irrelevant. Yes, Miss Marple said simply, but you're not alone in that. Everyone in this circle benefited from Eleanor's availability and accommodation. Everyone feared the disruption of examining too closely why she remained so consistently willing to put others first. That is not individual guilt so much as collective failure. Miss Pemberton had stopped knitting entirely. What you are describing is a form of community violence, is it not? Not physical, not even intentionally cruel, but violence nonetheless. We used Eleanor's sense of duty and her belief in her own unworthiness to extract service from her, while congratulating ourselves on our kindness in including her. The words fell into the warm room like stones, hard and undeniable. Mrs. Hartwell looked stricken. Mrs. Porter bowed her head. Mrs. Finch continued her slow, steady work on the grey shawl. "I would not use the word violence," Miss Marple said carefully, "but I would say that communities can be cruel in their kindness, can trap people in roles that serve the collective good, while diminishing individual possibility, and the such and arrangements persist because they are mutually convenient for everyone except the person most constrained by them." Mrs. Porter raised her head, and her expression held a kind of terrible clarity. "I see it now. I have seen it for days since Eleanor confronted me. Every memory has reorganized itself around this understanding. Every time I praised her for her helpfulness, I was reinforcing the prison I had built for her. Every time I spoke of how valued she was, I was reminding her that her value lay in her usefulness to others rather than in herself." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "that is precisely right. And that recognition, painful though it is, represents the beginning of genuine understanding rather than comfortable fiction." They sat in silence for several moments, the only sound the quiet click of Miss Marple's needles and the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. The light through the windows was beginning to fade. Though it was still early afternoon, the quality of attention in the room had changed, deepened, as though everyone present had passed through some invisible threshold into more honest territory. Finally, Mrs. Porter spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "Eleanor, I do not know how to make amends for what I have done. I cannot restore the 25 years that were shaped by my interference, but I want you to know that I understand now what I did, not just the initial deception, but the years of maintaining it, and I am prepared to accept whatever consequences you feel are appropriate." Mrs. Finch looked up from her work, meeting Mrs. Porter's eyes directly. "I do not seek consequences, Agnes. I seek change. I want the comfortable silence to end. I want questions to be asked rather than avoided. I want to be valued for myself rather than for my usefulness. Whether you or anyone else can offer that remains to be seen." "We can try," Miss Pemberton said firmly. "I can try." "As can I," Mrs. Hartwell added, wiping her eyes. "Though I fear I have been very blind, and learning to see truly will take time." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked around at the faces gathered in her sitting room. "What has happened these past weeks has been painful but necessary. Truth is often uncomfortable, particularly when it reveals our own complicity in maintaining convenient fictions. But discomfort is the price of honest understanding, and honest understanding is the only foundation on which genuine community can be built." She rose to refill the teapot, and the ordinary action seemed to release some of the tension in the room. Conversation resumed, tentatively at first, and then, with growing naturalness, though the subjects discussed were more careful and the listening more attentive than in past gatherings. When the circle finally disbanded as the afternoon drew toward evening, the farewells carried a different quality than before. There was less certainty, perhaps, but more genuine regard, less comfortable assumption, a more conscious effort. Miss Marple watched them depart from her window and thought that sometimes the resolution of a mystery brought not satisfaction, but the recognition of complexity, not answers, but better questions. The truth had been spoken without accusation, and that speaking had changed everything, though what would grow from that change remained uncertain. The needles could rest now, the pattern had been revealed at last. Chapter 10. After the knitting was put away. March arrived with its customary blend of promise and hesitation, and St. Mary Mead began the slow emergence from winter that marked the turning of the year. Gardens showed the first brave colours, hedgerows budded tentatively, and the light held a quality that suggested longer days ahead. The Tuesday knitting circle continued to meet, though its character had altered in ways both subtle and profound. Conversations were more careful now, less inclined toward comfortable assumption. Silences were shorter, questions more readily asked. Mrs. Finch attended regularly, her grey shawl growing steadily under her capable hands, a visible reminder that one could create for oneself as well as for others. On the first Tuesday of March, as they gathered at Mrs. Porter's house, a rotation that had been maintained despite everything, Mrs. Finch arrived carrying not only her knitting bag, but also a sealed envelope. The others noticed it immediately, but said nothing, allowing Mrs. Finch to settle herself and begin her work before she chose to speak of it. "I have written a letter," she said finally, her needles moving with their steady rhythm, "to Michael Ashcroft, or rather, to wherever he may be found, if he can be found at all." Mrs. Hartwell set down her teacup with a small rattle. "Oh, Eleanor, have you discovered his whereabouts?" "No. I have addressed it to the last location mentioned in his original letter, his family's solicitors in London. Whether they can forward it, whether Michael is still alive to receive it, these things I cannot know, but I found I needed to answer, even after all these years." Miss Pemberton looked up from her work with interest. "What did you say, if you do not mind my asking?" Mrs. Finch smiled slightly. "I do not mind. I wrote that I had received his letter only recently, that I understood now he had intended to return, and that knowing this had changed how I viewed the years that followed. I told him that whatever happened, whatever prevented his return, I bore him no ill will, and I thanked him for choosing me, even if that choice could not be fulfilled." "That is very gracious," Mrs. Porter said quietly. She had been working on a new cardigan in deep blue, and her fingers moved with particular concentration. "More gracious than I would have managed, I think, in your position." "I am not being gracious for his sake," Mrs. Finch said. "I am being honest for my own. I needed to acknowledge what was true, even if that acknowledgement reaches no one but myself." Miss Marple, whose needles had been clicking with their usual steadiness, paused to adjust a stitch. "It is a form of completion," she observed. "Not of the past itself, which cannot be completed or changed, but of one's relationship to the past." "Yes," Mrs. Finch said. "Exactly that. I am not trying to reopen what happened 25 years ago. I am simply acknowledging it clearly without the comfortable distortions we all maintained for so long." They worked in companionable quiet for a time, the afternoon light streaming through the windows making patterns on the carpet. The scene was much as it had always been. Women gathered for needlework and tea, but the quality of attention had shifted. There was less performance now, less careful maintenance of agreed-upon versions. Mrs. Hartwell broke the silence with uncharacteristic directness. "I have been thinking about what Jane said several weeks ago, about how we all benefited from Eleanor's accommodation, and I realise I must apologise. I have asked so much of you over the years, Eleanor, always assuming you had time and willingness because you lived alone. I never considered whether you might have preferred to use that time differently." "Dorothy, you need not apologise for asking," Mrs. Finch said gently. "I need only learn to decline when I wish to. That is my responsibility, not yours." "But surely," Mrs. Hartwell began. "No," Mrs. Finch said firmly. "I will not continue to make others responsible for understanding what I have not clearly communicated. If I wish to refuse a request, I shall do so. If I wish to pursue my own interests rather than serve the village's needs, that choice is mine to make." Miss Pemberton nodded approvingly. "That seems eminently sensible, though I confess I am still learning to ask rather than assume. Just yesterday I nearly asked if you would help with the children's concert refreshments before I caught myself and realised I should first inquire whether you were interested in doing so." "And I would have declined," Mrs. Finch said with a small smile. "I have decided to spend that evening visiting my cousin in Dorset. It is something I have been meaning to do for years." The exchange was brief but significant. Miss Marple observed how the others absorbed this information, not with offence at being refused, but with a kind of tentative approval. Learning new patterns was difficult, but not impossible. Mrs. Porter had been silent during this exchange, her attention apparently fixed on her knitting. Now she spoke without looking up. "I have been asked to organise the Spring Bazaar again this year. I have always done so, and I imagine everyone expects I shall continue, but I find I am questioning whether I should, whether perhaps it is time for someone else to assume such responsibilities." "Are you thinking of stepping back from village activities?" Miss Pemberton asked, surprised. "I am thinking," Mrs. Porter said carefully, "that my need to organise and manage everything may have come from the same place as my interference in Eleanor's life. A belief that I knew best, that my judgment should govern not only my own choices but others as well. Perhaps it would be healthier for everyone if I learned to occupy less space. Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you might simply learn to organise alongside others rather than for them. There is a difference between leadership and control." Mrs. Porter looked at her with something approaching gratitude. "Yes, I think that is exactly the distinction I need to learn." The afternoon progressed through its familiar stages, more tea poured, biscuits passed, the light shifting as the sun moved across the sky. But the conversation ranged more freely than in the past, touching on subjects both serious and trivial with equal ease. No one performed contentment. No one's usefulness was particularly remarked upon. When the gathering concluded and the members prepared to depart, Mrs. Finch remained behind briefly. She stood with Mrs. Porter in the hallway, while the others made their farewells. "Agnes," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I am working toward forgiveness. I am not there yet, perhaps, but I am trying. What you did was wrong, and its consequences shaped my entire life. But I also understand that you acted from pain rather than malice, and that recognition makes forgiveness at least possible." Mrs. Porter's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Eleanor. That is more than I deserve." "Perhaps, but it is what I can offer, and it feels more honest than maintaining resentment. We must both live with what happened. We might as well attempt to do so with some measure of grace." They parted with cautious warmth, and Miss Marple, who had been collecting her things, walked home with Mrs. Finch through the March afternoon. "You have found your way through this with remarkable wisdom," Miss Marple observed. "Many people would have chosen anger or withdrawal. You have chosen something more difficult." "I have chosen what allows me to continue living in the village while being true to myself," Mrs. Finch said. "Whether that is wisdom or merely pragmatism, I cannot say, but I find I am no longer willing to sacrifice honesty for comfort, either my own comfort or others." They reached Mrs. Finch's gate, and she paused with her hand on the latch. "Thank you, Jane, for seeing what needed to be seen, for asking what needed to be asked. I think I would have continued indefinitely in the old pattern if you had not helped me recognise it." "You recognised it yourself," Miss Marple said. "I merely observed what you already knew, but had not yet acknowledged." She walked the remaining distance to her own cottage as the afternoon drew toward evening. The air held that particular quality of early spring, cool but with warmth beneath it, the promise of renewal after long dormancy. Inside, she set her knitting bag aside and sat by the window, watching as lights began to appear in cottage windows across the village. St. Mary Mead looked exactly as it always did, comfortable and familiar, a place where people knew one another, and patterns were established and maintained through generations.